The prominent journalist William Lloyd Garrison, who published The Liberator, the leading anti-slavery newspaper of the day. Frederick Douglass, another towering figure in the anti-slavery movement, was born a Maryland slave in about 1817. Escaping to the North, he became an agent of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and a tireless orator for black freedom. In 1847, Douglass founded an abolitionist newspaper, the North Star.
He was politically active and simply involved in every aspect of life that he could in an attempt to improve the status of black Americans in the 19th century. There's certainly individuals in the 20th century, such as Martin Luther King, who've had a similar impact as Frederick Douglass did in his time. So I would say to a high school student that who is more likely to know of Martin Luther King in our modern time, that he should be aware of Frederick Douglass as the equivalent of a Martin Luther King in the 19th century.
On plantations, slaves performed numerous jobs and were placed in hierarchical ranks. Field slaves were usually divided into gangs of 5 to 10 and supervised by a slave driver, often a slave himself. Many slaves escaped to freedom along a series of trails known as the Underground Railroad. The railroad was a loose network of people willing to hide runaway slaves in their homes and conduct them to the next station or safe house until they could reach the free North. The Underground Railroad was also aided by Northern abolitionist organizations such as the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, who gave supplies and helped conduct slaves to freedom.
The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee was a very important group engaged in aiding fugitive slaves. It was a group that had operated from the late 1830s into the early 1840s, and it was comprised of fugitives as well as free blacks and white supporters. It was a group that aided the Underground Railroad, and their primary job was to aid fugitives with food and clothing and money, and to direct them on to other places.
Pursued by angry slave masters and bounty hunters, the route for escaped slaves was perilous and hard. Many did not survive the hardship or were caught and returned to their masters. The most famous guide on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Having escaped from a Maryland plantation in 1849, she became familiar with the roads, hiding places, and depots that were used to conduct runaways to freedom in the North.
Harriet Tubman was a brave, courageous, wise, and kind person. Not only did she concern herself about her liberty, but she concerned herself about people of all races. As you know, one reason why the Underground Railroad is so popular among people throughout the world is that people of all races, creeds, and colors came together.
Tubman's method relied on secrecy and surprise. She would gather money and supplies in the North, then slip down to the eastern shore through Delaware and into Maryland, arriving unannounced until the last moment. She would make contact with the slaves who were ready to escape.
She would simply appear on the eastern shore, and the word would be quickly spread to all of those who were determined that they would be free, where they should meet her at the appointed hour. And of course, those who chose freedom met her there and embarked with her on the trek to freedom. After she learned from her first venture that she could not trust slaves to determine that they were going to drop out, she packed a revolver, and for those who determined that they were going to turn around, she told them go forward or die.
To avoid suspicion, Tubman sang traditional slave spirituals to relay coded messages to slaves.
she stole away into the night and crept along the various slave quarters or cabins, oftentimes whispering or knocking on doors, more or less singing, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here, was a coded spiritual informing the slaves to steal away.
Having gathered her flock, Tubman would travel at night and conduct them to Delaware or Pennsylvania. She used only the most trusted contacts and safe houses along the route of the Underground Railroad. One such key station on the Underground Railroad was Johnson House in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Owned by Quakers, Johnson House was a safe haven for exhausted runaway slaves. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act intensified the risk for runaway slaves. Under federal law, any Negro accused of being a runaway could be returned to slavery by the sworn statement of the slave's owner. Northern states that had been safe for fugitive slaves became dangerous as runaway slaves were hunted for reward. To be safe, Tubman extended her Underground Railroad trail to St. Catharines, Canada, a town near Niagara Falls.
Walk together, children, walk together, children. Don't become weary. We're going to make it to the promised land. I have shoes, you have shoes, all God's children have shoes. When you get to heaven, going to put on their shoes and walk all over God's heaven. Heaven was a code word for Canada.
During her trips to the South, Harriet Tubman became known as the Moses of her people, referring to the biblical Moses who delivered his people from Egyptian bondage. She successfully conducted over 600 slaves to freedom, including her own family.
And freedom is a word that has tremendous resonance, particularly for Black Americans, but also for Americans in general, because slavery stands right behind it, and we know so much about what slavery meant. Slavery was a terrible condition that no one wanted to embrace or to be part of. So freedom is glorious because it's the denial, it's the triumph over slavery.
In 1857, the growing abolitionist movement suffered a setback when the United States Supreme Court handed down a controversial decision in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, a black slave, brought suit against his owner on the grounds that he had legally become emancipated while traveling through the free soil state of Illinois. The Supreme Court ruled against Scott, declaring that as a black man he was not a United States citizen and thus had no right to bring a suit in a federal court. More importantly, the court ruled that a slave did not automatically gain his liberty by entering a free state.
The legal system was available to African Americans to a certain extent, which means that they could pursue their grievances through the courts, but it did not mean necessarily that the courts would be sympathetic to their interests or that fairness would be the issue.
2 years after the Dred Scott case, an abolitionist named John Brown organized a plot to free Southern slaves through armed intervention. In order to secure sufficient weaponry, he led a raiding party of 13 whites and 5 blacks into the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
John Brown contacted Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and involved them in his Harper's Ferry plan to attack the slave-owning South and to liberate the slaves. Harriet Tubman was committed to join Brown. Frederick Douglass, however, studied the plan and determined that it would fail and decided that he would not be a part. Harriet Tubman would have been with John Brown at Harper's Ferry had she not become ill at the time.